Happy Easter morning, everyone. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. I'm Pastor Mark, and I'm really happy that you're joining us for this sermon podcast. I know that even though we cannot be together on this holy day, this day of celebration and joy, that nonetheless we are together in spirit and in prayer. Karl Barth, a 20th century Swiss theologian, said, "What brings people to worship, not just on Easter but any day, is an unspoken question clinging to their hearts and minds, and that question is simply this: is it true? Is it true that God lives and gives us life? Is it true that God not only established a routine, what we call the laws of nature, but that one day God broke that routine and somehow raised Jesus from the dead? Is it true that something so extraordinary happened on that first Easter that we can rebuild our lives on its foundation? Is it true? Something life-changing happened on that first Easter morning, because we know that the ones who were closest to Jesus went from being fearful to being faithful. They went from hiding out behind closed doors to bursting out through open doors and changing the world. Easter is the high point of the gospel, in which the Word became flesh and lived among us, full of grace and truth. The Easter event is where the whole story leads. Yet Easter is not the dramatic conclusion to the story of Christ's life. Rather, Easter is the beginning. When you read the first sermons preached in the early church that are recorded in the book of Acts, you see little reference to Jesus' teaching, and even his earthly life receives little attention. The first sermons were preached from the vantage point of Easter. Early Christians felt the movement of the Spirit among them, just as Jesus had promised them, and it brought renewed life and hope into their lives. They started with Easter. As Christians, we embrace this mystery of the risen Christ in our midst, even as we sometimes struggle with doubts because we witness so many life realities that undermine the presence of Christ. Because of Easter, we embrace the possibility of new beginnings, even as we struggle with our own slowness to begin that process of change. Early on the first Easter morning, according to John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed. This is a good place for us to enter the story with Mary, to experience the emotions that she must have had of not knowing what had happened. The reality of the human condition for us, as we know all too well, is that there are many ways in which we can become entombed by our attitudes, by life circumstances, or by life choices. There are metaphorical rocks that represent disappointment, insecurity, poverty, or guilt. People can get sealed into tombs of arrogance, confusion, addiction, or indifference. After a while, our eyes begin to adjust to the darkness, and we barely know the difference. Easter reminds us that Christ comes to do a new thing in our midst. The conditions and circumstances of our lives do not have to bury us beneath a load of care. They may be painful to manage or difficult to change, and yet the transforming presence of Christ, of God with us, offers a way to roll away the stones and release us to live again. So where do we look for the new thing that God is doing today? Where do we look to find the meaning of the mystery of Christ among us? Where do we look to notice the changes that are brought about by God's unrestrained love in the world? We need to look everywhere. We need to have the same curiosity about the things of God that we do about other things. We must look in all the corners of the world, in truck stops and dance halls, in theaters and boxing gyms, in grazing fields and ball fields, on mountains and molehills, on playgrounds and battlegrounds. We must look everywhere we live And we must take a long look, and we must take a loving look. And only then will we begin to understand what is real. We are told that Mary arrived early on the first day of the week. She came to the tomb while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been rolled away. How long did Mary stay there? How long did Mary look into the dark interior or search the garden surrounding the tomb? How long did Mary stand in that place startled and bewildered? We only know that in time she turned and ran to tell the other disciples, but tell them what? Her worst fear, her private worry that someone had taken the body of Jesus. When the movie A Beautiful Mind came to the theaters years ago, Dallas and I went to see it. It was our first date, although at the time we claimed it was just two new friends going to a movie together. A Beautiful Mind is a story about a brilliant mathematician whose genius of decoding complex messages is compromised by his delusional schizophrenia. When his illness begins to be more noticeable to those around him, he is forcibly taken for treatment at a psychiatric hospital. His wife visited him there, and in the brief moments of reaching out to see she saw that who he was becoming. And though she loves him dearly, there is no turning back, no returning to the innocence of fairer days. You see, one day at twilight, he had shown her constellations in the sky with the perception and precision of one who saw patterns everywhere. And now, the best he could do was speak from his paranoia, what he believed falsely to be true. How did his young wife feel when for the first time she realized that she was losing the man she thought she knew? What was the grief that she must have felt in those moments of recognition? I believe Mary, upon arriving at the tomb, felt a deep grief, a grief that settled in her heart and lodged there. Not only had her friend and teacher been cruelly beaten and killed, but now even his body had been taken away, and she must have felt truly alone. Grief is like that. It takes its toll privately. There's little others can do except stay close and be available. For even the presence of other people, or especially the presence sometimes of other people, grief will linger and rob you of joy. For Mary, grief was palpable, and it caused her to take to her feet, to run like the wind, and tell those who were closest to Jesus what she had found. An open door, but no body, nothing but emptiness. And that's exactly how she felt, empty. There is a sense of emptiness in our human experience when we are unable to touch what is real. There is an emptiness that at times can be palpable and frightening as it draws us deeper into dark places. Many of us know this sense of emptiness right now in this time in the world when we are having to isolate from one another and stay apart. The most touching part in the movie, A Beautiful Mind, came for me after they had been living with the disease for some time. The man's wife had decided that she wasn't going to recommit her husband to the psychiatric hospital in spite of some rather frightening things he had done. Realizing that he continued to see people that weren't there and that he couldn't completely put a stop to these delusions. At one point, the woman simply placed her hand on her husband's face and she said tenderly, quietly, "This is real." And then she took his hand and placed it on her face and she said, "This is real." It is a profession of faith, a statement of trust and love that somehow, in some way, they will make it if they are able to stay in touch with what is real. It is the human connections we make with one another that are real. To touch another's life is to touch the real. John's gospel goes on to tell how Mary returned to the tomb, and there she was alone in her grief. The other disciples had already returned home, and Mary stood there weeping. And then through her tears, she saw angels. She could still only express grief that someone had taken away the body of her Lord. She wanted to know where they had taken him and where the body had been laid. Finally, in the closing scene, Jesus stands before her, and only Mary doesn't recognize him. "Woman, why are you weeping?" he asks. Supposing him to be the gardener, Mary says, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She was still stuck in her grief. She's unable to see through her tears, and it's no wonder. The burden is just so great. Then came the word, the one word that was able to heal her. Mary. Jesus spoke her name. Mary. And in the speaking touched what was real in her. Her love, her truth, her inner beauty. We touch what is real when we become known to one another. We touch the real when our names are spoken by those who love us. We touch the real when we see in a new light who we are as God's beloved. Mary went from being alone in her grief to being alone in her joy. But it was a joy soon to spread and to be lived out among all who named the name of Jesus. Mary went from thinking that the best she could hope for was to recover the body of her Lord, to believing that her friend, her teacher, had reached through the shadows of death to appear to her and speak her name. Theologian Walter Burgart, from whom I borrowed the title for my message today, shares these thoughts on what is real. The reality, is not reducible to some far-off, abstract, intangible God in the sky. Reality is living, pulsing people. Reality is fire and ice. Reality is the sun setting over the Swiss Alps, a gentle doe streaking through the forest. Reality is a ruddy glass of Burgundy, Beethoven's Mass in D, a child lapping a chocolate ice cream cone. Reality is a striding woman with wind-blown hair. Reality is the risen Christ. Pastor Martin Copenhaver shares some reflections also on this gospel text that I find illuminating. He points out that the early followers of Jesus always started with proclamations about Easter as they shared their faith with the world. And he also suggests that the idea of resurrection would have been just as difficult for them to believe as it is for us. They were not stupid. They witnessed death every day. There was something in the story of Jesus' resurrection to doubt. There was something in the story that reached the deepest regions of their hearts and minds, where both doubt and faith are found. That is, in the resurrection, God gave us such a miracle of love and forgiveness that it is worthy of faith and thus open to doubt. Is it true that something so extraordinary happened on that morning that we can rebuild our lives on its foundation? Is it true that Christ is alive and extends life in the Spirit to us? Is it true? Here's how Copenhaver addresses the promise of Easter that over the centuries has been the occasion of greatest doubt and also the source of the most profound faith. He suggests realities about which we hold no doubt may not be large enough to reveal God to us. Perhaps we need to begin where the early church began, with the larger realities and deeper mysteries that are open to doubt, but are also large enough and deep enough to reveal something of God to us. Today we celebrate the Christ who is risen and present among us as we come together in spirit to express our gratitude to God for life and hope and healing. Life is precious. Life is meant to be lived generously and boldly. It is meant to be shared. The Gospels are clear on one thing. Resurrection isn't just limited to the experience of Jesus. It is not limited to life after death or how we understand eternity. Easter resurrection is not the conclusion to the gospel story, but rather the beginning of what God is continually doing to bring newness and life and hope into our lives and into our world. It is about passing from death to life here and now. Dwayne Zimmerman puts it this way: the message of the resurrection is not simply don't be afraid to die. Surely it is that, and all of us, when we lose someone we love or on our own day of dying, will need the comfort of the resurrection. But I believe the message of Easter is not simply don't be afraid to die, but don't be afraid to live. Someone else has said the message of resurrection and of Easter hope is that we can live fully in this life, giving of ourselves and risking for love's sake. Help someone who's hurting. Open the eyes of love for someone who is blind. Free a captive. Heal a wound. Feed someone who is hungry. Give the gift of yourself. For the gift of who we are was given to us in order to be given away. This is real. Take a long, loving look. The risen one is among us, even now. Thanks be to God.